Recently, this has become one of the big political topics across Europe, debated by governments, opposition parties, and populists alike. But if we cut through all the political fear-mongering, the bizarre and unrealistic predictions, and also avoid being overly optimistic with quick fixes, or even things like crypto hype, we should ask ourselves, is this really such a big issue? Welcome to my Maneko Invest channel, and in today's video we will take a simplified look at carbon allowances, how they work, what their purpose is, the problems linked to them, and whether you can actually invest in them, and what kind of potential that might hold. The European carbon trading system has been around for nearly 20 years, but it only became truly significant in the last decade, as the European Union's climate and green policies gained more prominence. Like many other parts of the world, the European Union is concerned about rising air pollution, but unlike a single state, which can simply introduce one carbon tax or strict regulations, the European Union had to find a more flexible solution, and that became the emission trading system. So how does it work? Each year, the European Union sets a target for how much CO2 emissions should be reduced. Based on this, it issues a limited number of allowances. These are mainly distributed through auctions where large companies or financial institutions, acting on behalf of smaller businesses, purchase them. One allowance equals 1 ton of CO2. And since companies are required to cut their emissions, they must either invest in cleaner technologies or buy the allowance they need to cover their pollution. The system may look simple, but that's not the full story. The European Union is extremely ambitious when it comes to its climate goals, far more than much of the rest of the world. Because of that, the requirement to buy carbon allowances could reduce the competitiveness of certain sectors, especially heavy industry. To prevent a massive relocation of production outside Europe, the European Union allocates a share of allowances to selected industries for free, in addition to those sold through auctions. According to the European Commission, between 2021 and 2030, 57% of new allowances are auctioned, while 43% are distributed free of charge to businesses in specific sectors. Allowances can also be traded beyond the auctions, on what's called the secondary market. This means that if a company buys more allowances in advance and later manages to cut emissions through new technology, it can resell the excess allowances at market price. On the other hand, a company that exceeds its limits without enough allowances faces severe, sometimes even business-ending, penalties. Not everyone can participate in this trading. Also, authorized companies and institutions have access to avoid wild speculation that could send prices skyrocketing. In practice, this system gives industries some breathing space to modernize, while the overall emission targets get gradually stricter. So why has this suddenly become such a hot political issue? Because a major change is coming. Starting in 2027, energy and fuel suppliers will also need to purchase allowances in amounts that reflect the consumption of their customers. And those customers are not just large corporations, but also households, essentially every single European citizen. This new system is called ETS2, and it will directly appear in our energy and fuel bills. In other words, over the next few years, almost everything that uses energy or fuel is likely to get more expensive. The impact of carbon allowances is far from uniform. It's one thing for someone living in a large city, who walks or cycles to work, lives in a modern apartment, and heats with electricity. But it's very different for someone living in an older house in the countryside, relying on an old car just to get to work or even to buy groceries. And beyond these lifestyle differences, there is an even bigger divide between European Union member states themselves. When the emission trading system was first introduced for companies, the idea was to set national limits, but that was quickly abandoned. Today, the market is unified across the entire EU, plus Norway, Iceland, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein. That also means a single carbon price for everyone, and this creates political friction. Wealthy countries may only feel motivated to change at higher prices, while in less affluent countries, even half the price will be enough to force change. To make the new ETS two system politically feasible, the European Union plans to release about 30% more allowances into auctions during the first years, ensuring enough liquidity and price stability. On top of that, there is a price cap. Allowances should not exceed 45 euros per ton of CO2 during the first 3 years. If prices go above that, the EU will issue additional allowances to push them back down. This 45 euros cap was set in 2020 and will rise each year in line with average EU inflation. By 2027, that cap is expected to reach around 57 euros per ton, which according to official models would translate into roughly a 1% increase in consumer prices. On paper, that doesn't sound dramatic, but in practice, the impact will be felt very differently for a city dweller in a modern apartment compared to a rural family in an old, energy and efficient house. But here is the twist. The European Union does have a solution in mind. Since it created this artificial system of allowances and sells them at auction, the EU collects money. And what happens with that money? Part of it is supposed to flow back to people through something called the Social Climate Fund. The goal is to support poor countries and vulnerable households that will be hit the hardest by the new system. Even today, revenue from carbon allowances is already used to finance various subsidy programs. For example, replacing old boilers, improving insulation, or other energy-saving measures. The Social Climate Fund will work in a similar way, with money redistributed via national governments. And here lies the problem. Rules will differ from one country to another. This means a low-income family in one EU country might get most of the cost covered, while a family in the same situation elsewhere could get next to nothing, simply because of stricter local conditions. Another issue, this support is currently designed to be temporary, what makes it look more like a short-term band-aid than a real long-term solution. On top of that, member states are required to contribute 25% of the fund themselves. We have already seen what this looks like with past subsidy programs, complicated rules that excluded many people, partial funding that still required families to cover large upfront costs or even take out loans, and elderly or low-income households left behind entirely. And if this new support ends up being distributed like housing allowances, there is a good chance many won't apply at all, and the money simply won't reach them. All of these could have far-reaching social, political, and economic consequences, from fueling extremist movements to sparking local unrest, and that's without any exaggeration or political scaremongering. The reality is that life in a modern city apartment is very different from life in a rural older home, and many people on both sides don't fully understand the other situation. Now the final question is, can I as an ordinary retail investor actually invest in carbon allowances and make money from them? The short answer is, not directly. You don't have access to the auctions or the trading platform. There are, however, some indirect ways. The more complex option is futures contracts, but that requires significant knowledge and capital. Another way is to invest in companies that benefit when their competitors are forced to buy expensive allowances. But this isn't exactly new, and renewable energy firms still don't offer spectacular returns. The simplest and most accessible option is through exchange-traded funds, ETFs, and similar products. For example, the American company Crane shares open two funds focused on carbon allowances. KUA and ETF tracking the EU market, plus Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. KRBN, an older ETF that covers the global carbon market, including California and the UK. Most funds use futures contracts. Fees are around 0.9% per year. Returns haven't been very impressive, but they do pay relatively high dividends, roughly around 7%. The catch? These payouts swing wildly, so don't expect stable income. Another issue is size. For example, KUA manages only about $6.5 million, which is tiny by US ETF standards and could mean liquidity problems. So it's no wonder some analysts publish dramatic forecasts of carbon prices shooting to €200 per ton. After all, funds like these profit when investors rush in, hoping to ride that wave. When it comes to green shares, these are US listed ETFs, which makes them difficult to assess for most European investors. You usually need a US broker or special assess, but don't worry, there are also European alternatives. Because of European Union regulations, they are structured as ETCs rather than ETFs. Wisdom Tree Carbon tracks the European carbon market. It's cheaper with an expense ratio of about 0.35%, but it's synthetic. Han ETF, Spark Change, Physical Carbon, EUA, ETC is more expensive at 0.89%, but it uses physical replication and has delivered slightly better returns despite the higher cost. Still, the performance isn't exactly groundbreaking. Since 2021, even some government bonds have done just as well or better. Though the real question is investing in carbon allowances even worth it? Let's be honest, this is an artificially created system with no intrinsic value, enforced by supranational institutions under threat of penalties. It was never designed as a mainstream investment vehicle. The very limited number of products available to retail investors proves that point. For most of us, carbon allowances won't be a path to wealth, but simply another line on our utility bills. Some people will barely notice it, others will feel the squeeze, and for a few it could be financially devastating. Thanks for watching today's video. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a like, leave a comment, and if you don't want to miss the next deep dive into finance and investing, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. And see you next time.